Hi, I'm joined by Owen Jones. Owen is a journalist. He's written for The Guardian, The Independent, New Statesman, and various other publications. He's also an author of two best-selling books, Chavs, The Demonisation of the Working Class, and The Establishment and How They Get Away with It. And he's also a political activist. Early this month, Owen Jones wrote an article for The Guardian titled We Can't Go Back to the Deadly HIV Stigma of the 1980s, and that's what we're here to talk about today. So in part, the article was written in response to the news of a Hollywood star who we now know to be Charlie Sheen disclosing his HIV positive status. And I was wondering, because obviously there was a bit of a media frenzy around that, and I was wondering, you know, how do the responses and the reactions to that revelation reflect the current state of HIV stigma in the 21st century?
Well, I think it was quite a depressing response in the sense it kind of was a kind of back to the 1980s style, kind of reaction, because it was the Sun newspaper who splashed it on their front page. And I think it was something like AIDS panic or HIV panic sweeping Hollywood. And, you know, the nature of that coverage was almost suggesting that, to have HIV basically means you're some walking biological weapon, you know, and that this is a terrifying, horrifying illness or disease to have, and by having, this person is putting other people at risk, and it really does go back to that kind of 1980s where it was kind of all about panic. You had these very menacing HIV adverts on television, which were intended to be very terrifying, but helped instill a stigma, or help create a stigma which has never really gone away. And it was I think the reason it was so depressing is I think HIV campaigners thought they'd come a long way in terms of changing attitudes and particularly in terms of the media, and this just really kind of trashed or reversed. They thought a lot of that work. So it was a frightening moment, but actually heartening as well, because it did cause a big backlash, which you probably wouldn't have got in the 1980s, because that was the headlines you get every other day, and so it caused a big backlash, and I think other media organisations will think carefully before they try and do something like that again.
And in the article you talk a lot about misconceptions associated with HIV and AIDS, and I was wondering, are there any that kind of stand out as kind of big contributors to the stigma that we clearly do have?
Well, there's lots, but I think the idea it's a death sentence. It did used to be tragically for many people, but now because of great advances in medicine, and the dedication of people working in medical science, we've got now these treatments which mean that people with HIV can expect to live normal life expectancies and to live healthy, normal lives. That the treatment is so effective that it can basically mean that the virus is undetectable in the bloodstream, dramatically reducing, making it a tiny risk actually, that the illness could be passed on. So I think there's those sorts of issues which have got, and also this idea that people with HIV pose this huge risk to people around them, which is simply not the case. Obviously, everybody should practice safer sex, not just because of HIV, because of a whole range of other STIs which exist as well. But I think this was, I think those are the key things really, that which is this is a big menace. We're people out there are at risk, huge risk because of the behaviour of others, and that it's a death sentence.
No, definitely. And you touch on quite a lot actually in the article about the inseparable links between stigma and the gay community and the associations that exist there. And I was wondering, what kind of impact does that have, the association between HIV and AIDS and the links that people will often automatically make and assumptions about the gay community? What kind of impact does that have?
Well, of course, it was initially often known as the gay plague. When you got, in places like San Francisco, you got clusters of people getting Kaposi sarcoma, if I've said that correctly. Illnesses which are exceptionally rare, but all of a sudden it was being clustered and disproportionate amongst gay men. I think then they call it originally gay-related immunodeficiency syndrome or something, GRIDS. For a long time it had that, and throughout the 1980s it was this idea of that this was this pandemic amongst gay people, and because particularly in the 1980s, homophobia was, I'm not saying homophobia has gone away, it certainly hasn't, but in the 1980s it was huge. You know, the British Social Attitude Survey showed about 2/3 of the population in the 1980s thought homosexuality was wrong, and you know, all that homophobia, that kind of disgust and all the rest of it that gay men in particular often suffer, fused with this sense of a gay disease, that, you know, they're kind of like these lepers at best to be pitied, but at worst to be feared as a threat. So I think, you know, it's HIV stigma and homophobia have always gone hand in hand ever since the pandemic began, tragically, back in the 1980s. And you know, they reinforced each other in lots of different ways. So I think there's always been that. Obviously, the reality today, there's still, you know, rates amongst gay people obviously higher than the rest of the population. There's obviously no point pretending otherwise, but you know, it exists amongst people from lots of different communities as well, including heterosexual for lots of different reasons. So, but the reality is, you know, it's a stigma. That kind of relationship with stigma and homophobia is very, very strong indeed, and has faded, but it's certainly not gone away.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, it's still, I think it's, as of this year, 75 countries, it's still, homosexuality is still criminalised.
Oh, well, that's the thing. If you look at globally, absolutely, and you get various unpleasant regimes making the point about gays being a threat because of HIV and that they're spreading diseases. So it's this idea, these are a bunch of disease-ridden, you know, threats to our community, and that in other countries is very, very intense, obviously.
Yeah, no, definitely. And interestingly, you touch on, again in the article, you touch on this idea of there's still actually quite a lot of stigma within the gay community, so it's not just targeted at, but it's also within. And I thought that was something I'd read and I wasn't familiar with before, so I think that's particularly
I think it's a very, very important point. I think, unfortunately, the way gay men have often been treated, I think, has been projected by gay men onto people with HIV in terms of the way they're treated. The same, you know, sense of, you know, for gay men for a very long time have had to face feelings of disgust, have been seen as lepers, have been seen as a threat, and now, I'm afraid, within the gay community, you get that towards people with HIV, and I think, you know, I think it comes down to a lot of things, because I think, you know, internalised homophobia very much exists, and I think that manifests itself in lots of different ways. You know, I think sometimes gay men have this sense of shame, which they don't talk about enough, and, you know, I know of people who've had sexual experiences, and then, you know, they have a cold a few days later, and they suddenly think, oh no, I've got HIV, and I think that was more actually to do with the kind of the sense of internalised shame and homophobia that they have. So I think, you know, back in the 1980s, this kind of this horror, you know, this horror film in the minds of gay people, the way they were treated, the HIV pandemic, it seems like a very bleak time, and, you know, they almost treat the HIV, any mention of it now, as a kind of reminder of this awful era that they don't want anything to do with. They fear that now, you know, they've got some acceptance, gay men. There's still a lot of homophobia to deal with, but they've got an acceptance people in the 1980s didn't have, and they fear, you know, if I get HIV, I'll go back to the same kind of rejection and stigma that I've shaken off. So I think it's very complicated, but I do think that, you know, I've come across people, when I wrote that article, people with HIV got in touch with me and said that the worst prejudice they receive is from gay men.
Right.
And I think that's a really important point. And I think, you know, within the gay community, there's lots of things to deal with. I think racism, misogyny sometimes, and I think this is something else. And just because you're part of a group which is historically and remains a group that faces oppression and prejudice, doesn't mean you're not also capable of your own oppression and prejudice. And this is one example, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I mean, clearly, you know, some people might deny it, but I think, you know, we've already seen that stigma is still certainly alive and kicking, even now in 2015.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, you know, Elton John says that HIV stigma is kind of the most deadly symptom. And I was wondering, kind of from your perspective, both in developed countries and in developing countries, what impacts does stigma have? What kind of barriers does it impose in terms of eradicating eventually HIV and AIDS?
Well, one of the key problems is people don't go and get tested because they're absolutely terrified of finding out they've got HIV. However slim a chance it is for people, just by going through the test seems a trauma in of itself. It seems a deadly serious thing to have to do in people's minds, and I think they don't fear so much the symptoms. I mean, if people are properly educated, they'll know that this is obviously a very treatable disease, albeit not a curable one. And I think they fear the stigma and rejection more than anything else. In other countries, that rejection is far more intense and stronger than it is here, but it is obviously a big problem here. And if people don't get treated, then the disease, the illness is able to progress, and that risks people's lives. And it also means, of course, the risk of that illness spreading as well, because people haven't been tested and they're not being treated for it. So stigma kills, of course it does. Stigma is the natural ally of this illness. It allows it to spread, it stops it from being treated, and if we take on the stigma, we educate people, we deal with the prejudice, then I think we will encourage far more people to get tested. I think it's something, is it 1 in 3 gay men, or 1 in 3 people with HIV don't know they have it. It's a very high figure. Might be 1 in 4. Might want to check that. 1 in 4. Sorry, 1 in 4. It's important we get that right. If 1 in 4, whatever, it's a high percentage of people who aren't being treated, and if they don't get treated, then obviously they're going to suffer problems which they won't face, and their lives will be at risk. So we've got to take on the stigma, otherwise people's lives are threatened. Yeah, definitely. And clearly the outlook, I think, or at least it seems to me, the outlook is uncertain as to how public attitudes are going to change and shift with respect to stigma. And you mentioned about kind of getting rid of this prejudice. What can we do as both individuals at a national level, at an international level? What can charities do? What can we do to get rid of the stigma? It is the deadliest symptom. Well, education, I think, is one of the key cures to stigma. I think people often simply aren't aware of. I know that the Terence Higgins Trust, who are a fantastic charity who specialise in HIV and dealing with HIV. But we just need far more resources thrown into education. Unfortunately, at a time of austerity, at a time of cuts, I think the danger is, when it comes to issues like this, support funding for charities and for local authorities and so on, who can actually educate people, being cut back. And actually, I think this is an example of how disastrous that is, because we really need more education, we need more resources plowed into it, not less, because people's lives and their health will otherwise be imperiled. So I'd like to see far more of that. People, far more of us being involved, whether it be through social media, just correcting our friends on these issues, speaking out about it, so even small things like that, but also supporting the work of campaigning organisations like the Terence Higgins Trust, donating. I have a monthly subscription, a monthly donation to them. I think encourage other people to do that as well, and that will, I think, help their work in terms of educating people and reducing the stigma. So there is hope that it's going to... Those are hope. These problems will always be dealt with. We're taking a scenic route. Well, just lastly on that, think about how far we've come since the 1980s. And we always have to take stock, because the danger is sometimes we emphasise the problems we have, which we do need to do because we need to overcome them, but we can end up painting a pessimistic view of things. And the important thing to emphasise is things have changed since the 1980s. Attitudes have changed significantly, and we just need to build on that work and keep pushing. And if we could get to where we are today, who knows where we'll get in the next 30 years. I'm very optimistic about myself. Fantastic. Owen, thanks very much. No worries, mate.